Hello and welcome back to Oxygen Not Included. Today we are going to cover plumbed bathrooms, aka washrooms, why to build them, how to build them, and some tips and tricks for managing them in the early game. I think a lot of newer players are kind of daunted at the prospect of building these sort of washrooms because they are in a sense a system than just a straight up building. You can't just drop a lavatory like you would a cot and have them get used like most buildings that you've built up to this point. And so meeting those requirements and understanding how to meet the requirements of a lavatory is something that can be a little bit daunting for newer players, and so they shy away from it. But lavatories are one of the most important early game things that you can build, and they really are not that complicated. There isn't a whole lot to them. I'm going to show you a system that's going to look a little bit complicated, but I think once I explain it, it's going to seem really simple, and you're going to be sort of off to the races on building a lot of the important systems of the game once you understand just the basics of how this thing is set up. So first off, why should you build a washroom? What is a washroom? How do you build it? Let's go over some of the basics. If we go to the room overlay, we'll see that this room has the washroom bonus because it meets all the requirements that are at least on the patch that this one is being built on. And I will note the differences between the current patch and the one that this one is being played on. This washroom requires a flush toilet, a plumbed wash station, no outhouses, so none of the older bathroom technology that you have, no industrial machinery, which is a variety of things, but you'll know it when you see it. Has a minimum size of 12 tiles and a maximum size of 64 tiles. So you can make this thing, say, 4 by 16, 4 high by 16 wide, and gives a morale bonus of +2. One addition that is not present on this patch, but is on the latest patch, is that this room requires a light fixture. You'll want to make this, say, 4 high and build a ceiling lamp somewhere. That ceiling lamp doesn't need to be on, but you just need to have a light fixture in the room for this to count as a washroom and get your +2 morale bonus. It isn't hugely important because the real reason we're building these is not for the +2 morale. We'll get morale from a bunch of different sources, and we don't really require a lot of morale early on in the game when our duplicants haven't trained for really complicated jobs. What we're really going for this for is for the lavatory. Why is that? So if I go to the lavatory here, this lavatory uses 5 kilograms of water per use and produces 11.7 kilograms of polluted water per use. Now, polluted water is something that can be converted straight back into water using a water sieve. A water sieve will take in 5 kilograms per second of polluted water and output 5 kilograms per second of water, so it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Filtration medium just means sand, so this is also a building that will convert over time sand into dirt. Very simple, very easy to set up, nothing really complicated about this. You supply it with power, you supply it with sand and water, and it produces clean water for you. So polluted water is pretty much as good as water, which means that on the net, we are generating 6.7 kilograms per duplicant per day, assuming no small bladder traits or something crazy like that. Every duplicant is going to go to the bathroom once a day, and they're going to generate sort of out of thin air. This is one of the ways in which the game sort of bends reality. They're going to generate more or less out of thin air 6.7 kilograms of water, which is also kind of impressive considering that duplicants themselves, I think, only weigh 30 kilograms. So that's, when they go to the bathroom and they produce 11.7 kilograms of something, they maybe have some dietary issues. I don't know. But in any case, that's the way the game is balanced. That's the numbers as they stand. And the reason why this is important is that water is one of the most important resources in the game. Not just true in the early game, but in the late game as well. Water is going to be determining how many duplicants you can support, because ultimately, at least on a lot of maps, and there are some changes and tweaks with new forest starting biomes and stuff like that can kind of change things around. But water is how you're going to be generating oxygen in the late game. In this case, we're also using it to generate oxygen in the early game because we're using this algae terrarium technology, which I like a lot. It'll convert this water into polluted water. That polluted water will off-gas into polluted oxygen. That polluted oxygen will be cleaned up by a bunch of deodorizers, etc., etc., etc. So we are using water to produce oxygen in the early game as well, even though we don't technically need to. But in the late game, once you've kind of ran out of algae, water is going to be your main resource for producing oxygen. And so any water resource you can generate is going to be very important. It's going to determine how many duplicants you can support on a given base. Also, a lot of the different foodstuffs that you might want to build, they oftentimes require water as a form of irrigation. So you're going to need water to supply them. Also, various like utility plants like thimbleweed. Thimbleweed requires a very large amount of water as an irrigation source, and so if you want to build insulation, if you want to build paintings, if you want to build Atmos suits, a lot of important stuff in the game, you're going to need to grow thimbleweed, and that thimbleweed is going to require a very large amount of water. So water, for a lot of reasons, is one of the most important resources in the game. Any way you have of generating more of it is something that you want to get online right away. And so getting a lavatory up, getting a working plumbed lavatory and sink system up is going to be very important because it's going to stretch your water supplies as much as possible. This isn't really a matter of life and death in the sense that we see I've taken a big pocket of water and I'm using it all to generate oxygen. I've taken a big pocket of water, I'm using it towards research. I have this other pocket of water, you'll get 3 per game, that I'm using to supply my bathrooms. In a lot of starts, you'll have a pretty good amount of water in your starting biome. And a lot of your food, like mealwood, doesn't really require any water to run. You don't technically need water to produce your oxygen either. You might have algae, or if you're in the forest biome, you'll have oxyferns, right? It's not critical to your survival, and so that's why we pursue oxygen generation and food production first, because those are critical to your survival. But this is, again, a system that's going to be generating one of the most important resources in the game. It's very low down on the tech tree. Here we've basically we're researching rockets at this point, but sanitation way back down here provides you the lavatory, the shower, and the sink, and all 3 of these can be used by your duplicants early on. This system is very easy to set up, very accessible early on in the game, and very important largely for this reason that it'll generate water. It also has benefits in terms of germs. Your duplicants will walk away with far fewer germs by using the system. They also will not be generating germy polluted dirt and germy bottles of polluted water. All that is going to be taken care of in the system. So they have less exposure to food poisoning through that process as well. But again, the main reason is generating these water supplies. So how do these work? What do you need? What are the requirements? Well, basically, if we go to plumbing and look at a lavatory, right? This lavatory, and we'll just kind of look at it down here. This lavatory has a white input tile and a green output tile. And these will accept inputs from liquid pipes, all right? So clean water is going to go in to the white one that we have currently on the left, and it'll go out the green one that we have on the right, and it'll produce polluted water will be coming out of the green one. We can also rotate this using O. So if you want to, have things this way, this is something that you can do. If you prefer this sort of setup in terms of, what side you have things on, or maybe if you just like the look of it better. In this case, we've just kind of gone with the default. That's what I have up here, right? This green thing right here is the output. This white thing right here is the input. And let me explain this plumbing system that I have right here. And let me explain, I think, liquid bridges and input-output systems as well. So here I have a water line that begins with this liquid pump up here, which is pumping out clean water from this pocket, pumping it down across here, right? And all across here, I have these liquid bridges with an input here and an output here. And the way that liquid bridges work, and really any bit of plumbing that has an input and an output, is that liquids will try and go in the input if they can. And if they can't, they'll continue on their way. They give priority to the input that they come across before continuing on. So as this water travels down, it tries to cross this liquid bridge down to here before it tries to go on this way. And so I could actually have this central water line continue on. I could say plumbing, liquid pipe, igneous rock, doesn't matter, and just stretch it on like this and go and supply some other systems, right? And it'll basically say, look, resupply these sinks and lavatories first, and then continue on to supply whatever this secondary system that I have over here is, right? This isn't just true of liquid bridges, but of liquid valves, liquid shutoffs, liquid anything that has this white icon and this green icon. It's going to try and cross over from that white icon to this green icon, or if they aren't linked in that way, it'll just try and go into the white icon before it continues on whatever path it also has available to it. So here I have this liquid bridge connecting down and then linking to the input section of this sink, right? And so it's basically saying, as the water comes down here, prioritize refilling this sink if this sink needs refilling. And if not, continue on to the next one and try and refill that, and then continue on to the next one, try and refill that, and so on and so forth. And here we see someone they've just used this lavatory. We see the polluted water coming out of the output, and we see fresh water traveling across this liquid bridge to this input right here, right? So you have a central water line in. We have a bunch of lines spoking off to supply each of the individual buildings. This makes it so that the water at every step of the way knows where it wants to go. This prevents the system from having to do a lot of calculations in terms of water pathfinding. There's no point at where the water has to kind of guess where it's going. It always knows, I continue on here, I hit the bridge, and if I can, I resupply, if not, go on. And then we have a water line out, right? We simply have the same thing, a central water line out that then connects to a liquid vent, which is just going to dump the water on the ground. And so all the outputs are then linked by liquid bridges to this central polluted water line out, right? For good measure, I've also put a liquid bridge right here so that all these systems know this is the direction that they're going. It also allows me to, if I want to, kind of spoke off from this, right? I could have another line that says if this thing is backed up, then continue on somewhere else. I think it's very important to not shy away from using these liquid bridges. They make things look complicated, and you do need to know what you're doing, but they make the computational requirements for running your base a lot lower, and they make sure you don't run into systems where the water isn't moving because it's gotten confused as to what direction it wants to go. It doesn't get trapped between these two inputs, for example, because it knows I continue on and I do this unless X happens, right? So that's the system. Central water line in, bridges to connect up each of these sinks and lavatories, and then bridges to connect up the outputs and merge them all onto one line. An additional note is that while crossing a bridge like this or going into an input has priority, leaving an output does not have priority. So going into an input has priority. Packets of water that are traveling down here will try and enter into this bridge if they can, or if I had linked it up so that they were going through this input area down here, they would try and input this building before they continued on their way, right? But outputs do not have that priority. Outputs are the reverse. Whenever you're trying to merge onto a lane, that lane is given priority. So in this system, if I have everybody using the bathrooms at once and a bunch of polluted water is traveling down here, and I have some polluted water kind of waiting here, that polluted water will not cross over this bridge and exit until the right way is clear, until this line has kind of cleared of all of its passengers. This will just sort of wait in reserve, right? And that's something to keep in mind. Merging is lower priority, branching is higher priority. So there's a lot of systems we're going to set up later on. This is just one of the early ones that will take advantage of this to set up priority lines and non-priority lines, but something to be aware of, something to understand going forward. That's the way that the plumbing works in the game. And getting a handle on that is really important to making everything work really smoothly. So central line in, bridges to connect each of the individual things that we want to supply, bridges out onto a central line, and then it goes out here. A lot of builds that you look at close this system. So right now it's this sort of what you might call an open system. We have a supply of water over here. It's just being pumped in on our central line. And then we have an output of water that's just going into this sort of basin that I've created over here. Some systems will say, and in fact, you'll see a lot of advice given on videos, will say, look, you should have this thing be a loop, right? Loops are so much cooler. Loops are so much better. They'll go to refinement and they'll grab a water sieve, and instead of having this just dump out, they'll instead say put a water sieve right here, right? And then they would go plumbing, liquid pipe, and they'd connect up, maybe a little bit less squealy than that. I'm not going to go back and fix things, but they'll go back and they'll reconnect to here. And so they'll have the output of that water sieve. I should really stop holding down this button. They'll have the output of that water sieve connect back up into the input. And because we're generating more water than we use, this system can remain forever supplied. In fact, the way they would usually accomplish it is they would say plumbing, liquid bridge. On the line that connects back into here, they will have a liquid bridge, say like so, and then it links back up to here, where it'll say, look, resupply this system first, and if there's excess water, put it somewhere else. So right, they have their water sieve over here, and then they just run a line like so, right? And then they can have some water storage area over here if they wanted to. And basically this system will resupply itself as a priority. It'll say, look, take this line if you can, and then any excess will go somewhere else. This is a very common thing that you'll see. I don't recommend it actually as an early system. In the end, you're going to want to enclose the system because eventually pockets of water like these are going to run out, right? And you're going to want to have a renewable source of water. Why not use this to supply its own source of water? That's really simple. Early on, there are a few issues with that. And let's start getting into them. One of the ones that you might think is an issue but isn't an issue is the germs. This is germy water, right? It's full of food poisoning because it's, the product of toilets and people washing their hands after using the toilets. It's actually perfectly fine to use germy water in these buildings. You can just loop it back without de-germifying it. An important thing to note is that water sieves do not de-germify water. They change it from polluted water to clean water, but they don't actually remove the germs from that water. It'll be clean water with germs in it. But that doesn't matter. These duplicants will use germy water to wash their hands and still be perfectly clean. They'll use it in their showers and be perfectly fine. This water, in fact, can be scalding if you want it to. It can be, 90 degrees. Duplicants will shower in 90 degrees Celsius water and be perfectly fine with it. They'll wash their hands with it. They'll use it in their toilets. No problems there. So a thing that isn't the problem is the germs. That's fine, right? And in fact, is part of the reason why there is a suggestion to make this a closed loop, because germy water is in a sense less useful than non-germy water. And so they want to say, look, just keep recirculating it through here, and then you'll have a smaller amount of germy water that you have to deal with or process in some way. The problem, as I see it, and the reason why I don't suggest setting up this sort of recirculating loop early on, is that the outputs of the water sieve, it does not say it here, but all of the water that is output by the water sieve is output at 40 degrees Celsius. All right, 40 degrees Celsius. It doesn't matter what water temperature came in. This water could have been 90 degrees. It could have been 10 degrees. It doesn't matter. It's going to output 40 degree water. And because you don't have access to perfectly insulated pipes early on, what this is going to mean is that these pipes that you have carrying this 40 degree water and recirculating it back amongst itself are slowly going to radiate their heat to their environment. Right, through conduction, these pipes are going to give off their heat and slowly cook this entire area to 40 degrees. You might be saying, well, 40 degrees is still reasonable. Duplicants will be perfectly fine in 40 degrees. The problem is that things like farms, like this mealwood right here, require a body temperature of 10 to 30 degrees. And so one of the problems that you get into early on if you set up one of these recirculating loops is that you then really increase the speed at which you need to develop a heat solution, a way of getting rid of the heat that this system is inadvertently generating. So I like just putting things in a basin like this at the start. I have plenty of water to run the system right now. This is the only timer that I'm really on, is finding new water sources. I've already kind of started exploring upwards to find, this cool steam vent, some ice, pockets of polluted water that I can convert into water, all sorts of things. But the important thing is I don't want to generate that 40 degree temperature early on. And so a lot of my bases will just have this open plan, slowly fill this area up with polluted water. I'll deal with it later is the idea, right? This also has the advantage of, when you have this open plan, of letting you take the polluted water that you had in your sinks, or not your sinks, your wash basins, taking the polluted water that was left over in your wash basins and just dumping it into this storage area using a bottle emptier. Right here I've set it to sweep only and polluted water, and then when I deconstructed my wash basins here and the polluted water fell out into bottles, I just said sweep up this polluted water, put it into here. That makes this process a little bit simpler as well. Right, you're going to need this sort of open pit type thing anyways to make this system work. Because you're going to want to clean up the polluted water that you had from your old system. So I don't think it's much of a cost to build this thing. You kind of need something along these lines anyways, right? In addition, because we are not just directly linking things to a water sieve and recirculating, one, we're avoiding having that 40 degree heat problem, but also we're reserving the possibility later on that we can use that water sieve to delete heat, right? One thing that we can do is we can go to utilities and put something like a thermal aqua tuner in a room. I wouldn't use it in this room right here. We'll talk later about how to set these systems up. But later on, I might want to heat up this polluted water to something like 90 degrees. Or actually, I could put it all the way to, say, like 115 degrees, because polluted water has a different boiling point than normal water. But I could heat up this water to a really high degree and then run it through the water sieve. And the water sieve, again, has a fixed output of 40 degrees Celsius. It'll take all that 100-degree water and turn it into 40-degree water, right? So by keeping this polluted water around, I'm keeping it as a potential solution to heat problems that I have, that I can dump a bunch of heat into this water and then delete that heat by running it through a water sieve. So I like storing it up here first. And then finally, another reason why I like putting it into one of these sort of large basin rooms is that this polluted water will slowly release polluted oxygen, which means I can take some deodorizers right here and use this room early on to supplement my oxygen supply, right? As this polluted oxygen evaporates from this polluted water and passes through these deodorizers, it'll generate more oxygen for my base. So early on, I actually don't recommend building one of these self-sustaining bathrooms. They sound really cool, and they are something that you're going to want to do in the late game, but in the immediate term, they generate some heat problems for your base. In the sense, they're wasting an opportunity, 1, to generate oxygen, 2, to delete heat, and 3, to just, manage your water supplies differently. I might not want, right? I might be perfectly fine just using up this water right now. I don't necessarily want to have this water here. I might want to put more farms here, right? Cleaning this water out and putting it into a nice contained area that I've set up is an advantage in my book as well. So pretty simple system, not that much complicated to it. I know I've talked a long time about this, about all the different things you want to change. A lot of the same rules apply, obviously, when we set up in the sort of the day one guide that I provided. I talked about how to set up a latrine. A lot of the same rules apply here. You want to have about as many sinks as you do lavatories. That way, if in the worst case scenario where everyone is going to the bathroom at once and they all leave at once, they all have a sink to go to wash their hands. I also like some setups like this, basically, where there's a lavatory that they can get to fairly early, right? Like if there's just one duplicant going to the bathroom, they don't need to run to all the way in the back of this room. They can just stop here. But also they have, the sinks in front of them, so when they leave this way, they're always going to wash their hands, right? So I can have the lavatory fairly early on in this room if there's just one duplicant using it, but I still have a bunch of sinks between them and the door. Basic setup stuff like that is still the same. Nothing changes when switching from a latrine to a lavatory. And I think that's it. I think that's everything I want to talk about. Again, central water line in, bridges to each of your individual things that you want to supply, bridges out, merging all onto a central line. And then in the early game, I would just have that central line dump into some pool. If in later game, you would have this be a water sieve, or have some heating of the water occur before it gets put into a hot water sieve, and then resupply the addition of the other system. One other thing that I want to note again is that, actually this will be the first time I've noted it, the outputs from lavatories are at the same temperature as the inputs, right? So if I put water in at 22.4 degrees, it's going to put water out at 22.4 degrees. An important thing to note is that this water is getting more than doubled, right? The polluted water is not going to be 5 kilograms, it's going to be 11.7 kilograms, right? And so having this water that come in be relatively cool is also going to be a nice thing, because it's going to double up on that coolness. It's going to take the 5 kilograms of cool water and turn it into 11.7 kilograms of cool water, with its obviously higher heat capacity because it's just more water. So keep that in mind when setting up any sort of system like this. You want cool water coming in if you can, and then you can dump a bunch of heat into the polluted water before running it through a water sieve to delete a lot of heat. That's getting into more advanced topics, but yeah, I think this is the way you should be setting up your systems. I'm going to end the video here. I think I've talked enough. I'll catch you guys next time.